The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, champagne, and polished marble. Carter Wexley stood near the balcony of his Manhattan penthouse, holding a crystal glass filled with aged whiskey. From this height, the city glowed beneath him, a shimmering sea of lights stretching into the distance. He owned half the skyline, or at least, he had built much of it. The gala was extravagant, as always. High-profile guests dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns laughed and toasted, discussing real estate, stock markets, and the next big investment. Carter listened with half an ear, his attention drifting. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Frowning, he stepped away from the lively chatter and answered. "Mr. Wexley, there's a situation." The voice on the other end belonged to one of his site managers. "What is it?" Carter asked, swirling his drink. "One of your properties, there's a fire." "It's bad." He exhaled sharply. "Then handle it. That's why I pay you." The man hesitated. "Sir, it's your estate." Carter froze. His estate. His home. He didn't wait to hear more. His glass hit the table as he grabbed his coat and rushed for the elevator, ignoring the murmurs behind him. The city blurred outside the car window as his driver sped through the streets. His grip on his phone tightened. When he arrived, flames were devouring the mansion. Fire trucks lined the driveway, red lights flashing against the dark sky. Smoke curled into the air, thick and merciless. Everything, his art, his collections, his legacy, was being reduced to ashes. A firefighter approached him, his expression grim. "Mr. Wexley, I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do." The fire spread too fast. Before Carter could respond, his phone buzzed again. Vincent Calloway, his trusted business partner. Relief flooded him as he answered. "Vincent, I need..." "Carter." The voice on the other end was calm, detached. "I heard about the fire. There's nothing I can do." Silence. Carter's chest tightened. "You don't understand. Everything I own." "Not anymore." The call ended. Carter stood there, the heat of the flames licking at the night sky. His empire was gone, and he was alone. Carter sat motionless on a bench in Central Park, the morning chill biting through his thin suit. 2 days had passed since the fire. 2 days since his life had collapsed. His bank accounts were frozen, his assets seized. The financial world had already turned its back on him, whispers of fraud and bad investments circling like vultures. Not one of his so-called friends returned his calls. Not even those who had once begged for his attention. He had tried the hotels he once frequented. They had denied him at the front desk, their polite smiles masking their distaste. His own penthouse, a property he had assumed was safe, had been repossessed overnight. Now, his only possession was the clothes on his back, a now wrinkled suit, shoes scuffed from walking aimlessly through the city. No wallet, no phone, no security. By nightfall, the hunger set in, a deep, gnawing emptiness that he had never experienced before. He passed a small cafe and, for a moment, considered asking for help, but the sharp stares from the staff reminded him who he used to be. He was Carter Wexley, or at least, he had been. The cold intensified as he wandered past the darker corners of the city, where people looked away rather than acknowledged him. His body ached from exhaustion, his vision blurred from dehydration. At some point, he stumbled into an empty back alley. The streetlights barely reached the space between the buildings, and the damp air made his suit cling uncomfortably to his skin. He sat down against the brick wall, his body too weak to continue. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere to go. His head swam, his eyelids grew heavy, and for a brief moment, he considered if it would be easier to just let go. Then, a voice. "Hey, are you okay?" He blinked up at the silhouette of a woman. Her tone was cautious but not unkind. Her dark curly hair framed a concerned face. Before he could answer, the world tilted. His vision darkened, and the last thing he felt was the warmth of small hands pressing against his arm. Then, nothing. Carter stirred, his body aching as warmth wrapped around him. It was unfamiliar, soft, unlike the cold pavement he had last felt beneath him. His eyes blinked open to dim lighting, the scent of something faintly sweet filling the air. A small living room, modest but clean. The walls were lined with second-hand furniture, a couch that had seen better days, and a stack of children's books in the corner. The place felt lived in, comfortable, real. Then, he saw her. The woman from the alley. She stood near a tiny kitchen, pouring something into a mug. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, sat at a nearby table, watching Carter with open curiosity. Carter forced himself to sit up, wincing as his body protested. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse. The woman turned, arms crossed. "My house. Don't get any ideas. You were unconscious in the alley." Carter exhaled sharply. He tried to push himself up, but the dizziness hit him hard. The boy hopped off his chair, walking over with something in his hands. A plate. A sandwich. He held it out. "You should eat." Carter hesitated. The woman, Rowan, spoke up. "He's right. You look like you haven't eaten in days." His pride bristled. He wasn't some charity case, but his stomach betrayed him, twisting painfully at the scent of food. Reluctantly, he took the plate. The first bite was like fire in his empty stomach, but he swallowed it down. The boy grinned. "I'm Elliot. What's your name?" Carter hesitated. For the first time in his life, his name meant nothing. He wasn't Carter Wexley, billionaire mogul, anymore. Just a man who had lost everything. "Carter." His voice was quieter than usual. Elliot nodded, seemingly unbothered by the lack of grandeur attached to it. Rowan sighed. "You can stay here. For now. But there are rules." Carter frowned, shifting in his seat. "Rules? You pull your weight," she said flatly. "No sitting around. No expecting handouts. I don't care who you used to be." The word stung, but deep down, Carter knew he had nowhere else to go. "So, for now," he nodded. Rowan didn't trust him. He could see it in her eyes. But for tonight, at least, he wasn't alone. Rowan stood at the kitchen sink, her hands gripping the edge a little too tightly. The low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house were the only sounds filling the space. Behind her, Carter slept on the couch, his breathing steady, as if he hadn't a single care in the world. Her fingers curled into her palms. How could life be this cruelly ironic? She hadn't recognized him at first, not when she found him slumped in that alley, barely conscious. But now, in the light of her small home, the face was unmistakable. Carter Wexley, the man whose company had bulldozed her childhood home. Rowan's stomach churned with resentment. Years ago, her brother had fought to stop the demolition, gathering documents, pleading with the city. It hadn't mattered. The land had been cleared for one of Wexley's luxury developments, and her family had been forced out, left with nothing. Now, that same man was sleeping under her roof. She glanced over her shoulder at him. He looked different from the confident, sharp-suited businessman she remembered from news reports. He was thinner, exhausted, broken. A part of her wanted to wake him up and throw him back onto the street. Let him know exactly who she was and what his empire had done to her family. But another part, the part that knew what it was like to be abandoned with nowhere to turn, hesitated. She exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her tired face. This wasn't the same man anymore. That Carter Wexley had been untouchable, shielded by wealth and power. This one, he had nothing, and as much as she wanted to hate him, she couldn't bring herself to be as merciless as the world had been to him. Rowan clenched her jaw and made her decision. He could stay, for now, but that didn't mean she trusted him. In the dim light, Carter shifted in his sleep, his brow furrowing, as if even in rest, something haunted him. Rowan turned away, pouring herself a glass of water. She would keep an eye on him, because whether he remembered or not, Carter Wexley had already taken something from her once. She wouldn't let him take anything more. Carter tightened his coat around himself as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the morning chill sharp against his skin. He had always moved through the city with purpose, power, a man who knew exactly where he was going. Not anymore. For the last few hours, he had been met with the same rehearsed smiles, the same thinly veiled rejections. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wexley. We just don't have any openings at this time. Given recent events, I don't think you'd be a good fit. Try again in a few months." The answers varied, but the meaning was the same. No one wanted him. At one point, he stopped at a construction site, swallowing his pride. Manual labor. It was beneath him, or at least it used to be. But money was money. You're joking, right? The foreman laughed when Carter asked about work. You'd last an hour. Carter clenched his fists but said nothing. He was starting to understand. The world that had once bent to his will had moved on without him. By the time he made it back to Rowan's house, he was exhausted, his stomach empty, his pride in tatters. Rowan was at the small kitchen table, flipping through overdue bills. She barely glanced up. Any luck? Carter let out a humorless laugh and sank into a chair. Oh, plenty. Just not the good kind. She sighed and ran a hand through her hair. He wasn't sure if it was out of frustration for him or for her own problems. Maybe both. Look, she said finally, tapping the edge of one of the papers. You don't have to mope around. The sink's been leaking for weeks. You want to help? Fix it. Carter scoffed. I don't fix sinks. She raised an eyebrow. Then you don't eat dinner. He stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, but she didn't. Carter exhaled through his nose and stood, rolling up his sleeves. He didn't know the first thing about home repairs, but he knew how to figure things out. As he searched for tools, he caught a glimpse of Elliot watching him, curiosity in his wide eyes. For the first time in his life, Carter Wexley was about to work for a meal. And strangely, he didn't hate the idea as much as he thought he would. Carter stood at a dingy payphone, gripping the receiver so tightly his knuckles turned white. The line clicked, then a familiar voice filled his ear. Calm, composed, and completely indifferent. Carter, I was wondering when you'd call. Vincent Calloway. Carter swallowed the sharp taste of humiliation. Vincent, I need a loan. Just enough to... A laugh. Cold. Dismissive. A loan? Carter, you don't have anything left to borrow against. What exactly are you offering? His jaw tightened. I built that company with you, and now it's mine. Silence stretched between them. Vincent's tone softened, falsely sympathetic. Let me give you some advice. The world forgets men like you quickly. No one is waiting for your comeback. Do yourself a favor. Stay gone. The line went dead. Carter stood there, staring at the receiver, the weight of reality pressing down on him. The fire had taken everything, but now it was clear. It wasn't an accident. Someone had made sure he lost everything. And that someone was Vincent Calloway. Across town, Rowan stared at the envelope in her hands, the past creeping in like a cold wind. The letter had arrived with no return address, its edges worn as if handled too many times. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting unmistakable. Her brother's handwriting. She sank into a chair, her pulse quickening as she read. Rowan, if anything happens to me, don't believe what they tell you. Wexley and Calloway, they're hiding something. I tried to stop it, but it goes deeper than we thought. If you ever get this letter, don't trust anyone. Her stomach twisted. This was written before he died. Her fingers trembled as she set the letter down. For years, she had blamed Carter Wexley for everything. But now she wasn't so sure. She looked toward the small window, where Carter was outside, struggling with an old rusted pipe. He wasn't the man she had imagined all these years. He wasn't ruthless anymore. And yet, his name was tied to whatever had destroyed her family. Rowan folded the letter, pressing it tightly against her chest. She wasn't sure what terrified her more. The possibility that Carter had known about this all along, or that he had been just as blind to it as she had. Carter sat at the small kitchen table, watching Elliot frown at a pile of paper and markers. The boy tapped a pencil against his chin, deep in thought. What exactly is this project supposed to be? Carter asked, glancing at the scattered supplies. Elliot sighed dramatically. A model of a city. It's supposed to show smart urban planning or whatever. Carter smirked. You say that like it's boring. The boy rolled his eyes. It is boring. My teacher keeps saying stuff about making cities for people, not just money. Carter's interest peaked. Well, cities don't build themselves on good intentions. Money makes things happen. Elliot squinted at him. Mom says money isn't everything. Before Carter could respond, Rowan's voice cut in from the kitchen. Your mom is right. Carter turned, finding her standing at the sink, her back tense. She had been listening. Rowan wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked over. Success isn't just about how much you can buy, Carter. He leaned back, arms crossed. No? Then what is it about? Rowan set her jaw. It's about the people you help, the ones who count on you. Carter scoffed, shaking his head. That's an idealist's answer. She narrowed her eyes. And yours is a coward's answer. The words struck something deep in him. For years, his success had been built on control, on power. And now, he had neither. The room fell into silence. Elliot, sensing the tension, quietly began cutting shapes out of paper. Carter exhaled and looked down at the project again. A city built for people, not just money. The idea lingered in his mind longer than he expected. After a beat, he reached for a marker. All right, kid. Show me what you've got so far. Elliot's face lit up. Really? You want to help? Carter shrugged. I have experience in urban planning. Might as well put it to use. Rowan watched the exchange, arms still crossed. But something in her gaze softened. For the next hour, Carter sketched blueprints while Elliot added buildings made of cardboard and glue. At one point, Carter looked up and caught Rowan watching him. Something passed between them. Not quite understanding, not quite trust, but something was shifting, and neither of them could ignore it. Rowan sat at the edge of her bed, the letter trembling in her hands. The words scrawled across the worn paper were burned into her mind. Her brother had tried to warn her about Carter Wexley. She should have thrown him out the moment she recognized him. She should have told him exactly who he was to her, what he had done to her family. But every time she looked at him now, he wasn't the man she had spent years hating. He was something else, something broken. She clenched her jaw. It didn't change the truth. Taking a deep breath, she walked into the small living room. Carter sat on the couch, flipping through an old newspaper, the dim lamp casting shadows over his tired features. He barely looked up as he spoke. You look like you have something to say. Rowan tightened her grip on the letter. I do. She tossed it onto the table between them. Carter frowned, reaching for it. The moment he saw the handwriting, his face changed, eyes narrowing, lips pressing into a thin line. Where did you get this? It was sent to me. Carter read through the words quickly, but she could tell the impact was immediate. His fingers tensed around the edges, and he leaned back as if the letter had physically struck him. You knew my brother, Rowan said, crossing her arms. Didn't you? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I don't know. He hesitated. I didn't handle small disputes. She scoffed. Small disputes? You destroyed people's homes. Carter looked away, guilt flickering across his face. I didn't approve those deals directly, but you didn't stop them. Silence. Rowan's voice softened, but her anger remained. My brother tried to fight back. He was convinced your company was doing something illegal. And then, she swallowed hard. Then he died. Carter's head snapped up. Are you saying? I don't know what I'm saying, she admitted. But I do know one thing. Vincent Calloway was part of this. And so were you. Carter rubbed a hand over his face. I never knew. But the weight in his voice told her. He believed her, asterisk. She should have felt victorious. Instead, all she felt was a sinking sense of something bigger, darker, lurking beneath the surface. Neither of them had the full truth. But now, they both had questions. The rain tapped lightly against the windows, filling the small house with a rhythmic hum. The living room was dimly lit, the only real light coming from the flickering glow of an old lamp in the corner. Elliot sat on the floor, sorting through a stack of records, his face scrunched in concentration. This one, he finally declared, pulling a vinyl from its sleeve and setting it onto the record player. A soft, old jazz melody filled the room. It was slow, smooth, the kind of song that felt like a memory. Rowan chuckled as she leaned against the couch. Good choice, kid, Carter smirked, swirling the last of the tea in his mug. Didn't peg you for a jazz fan. Rowan arched a brow. There's a lot you don't know about me. Elliot suddenly looked up, eyes bright with an idea. You guys should dance. Carter laughed, shaking his head. Not happening. But Elliot was already pulling at Rowan's hand, his excitement impossible to ignore. She groaned, rolling her eyes. All right, all right. Then, she turned to Carter, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Come on, Mr. Big Shot. Afraid of a little dancing? Carter hesitated. The idea of dancing had never intimidated him. He had led countless women across ballroom floors at high-profile events. But this was different. Elliot grinned. You gotta do it now. She challenged you. Carter sighed, setting his mug down. Fine, but if I step on your feet, it's your fault for forcing me into this. Rowan let out a soft laugh as she stepped closer. Deal. She took his hand, guiding it to rest lightly on her waist. Carter expected her to be hesitant, but she moved with ease, her steps natural, like she had done this 1,000 times before. Just follow my lead, she murmured. For once, Carter let someone else lead. The warmth of her hand in his sent a strange, unfamiliar sensation through him. They moved in slow circles, the music filling the small space between them. Rowan's laugh was soft, genuine, and Carter realized he had never actually heard her laugh like that before. And then something shifted. Their movements slowed, her breathing close against his. His fingers instinctively tightened on her waist. Rowan's gaze flickered to his lips, just for a second. He leaned in. Then, she pulled away. A small step, a quiet retreat. Rowan's expression was unreadable, but Carter could see the conflict in her eyes. We should stop. Her voice was softer now. Carter exhaled, nodding. But as she turned away, his heart pounded with one undeniable truth. He was falling for her. And for the first time in his life, that terrified him. Carter sat at Rowan's small kitchen table, a notebook open in front of him. He had spent the last hour piecing together what little he could remember about Rowan's family home, cross-referencing it with names, dates, and past business dealings. The more he dug into old memories, the more something felt off. The demolition had been rushed. He hadn't questioned it at the time, but looking back, the deal had moved too quickly, too cleanly. No room for appeals, no press involvement. And it wasn't the only one. He tapped his pen against the table, eyes narrowing. This wasn't just about Rowan's family. There had been others. Rows of small homes, swept away in quiet transactions. Property seized. Paper trails wiped clean. His gut twisted. How many people had been ruined by deals he had blindly signed off on? He scrolled through an old contact list on a borrowed laptop, searching for a name he hadn't thought about in years. James Richter, an ex-accountant from the company who had been fired under suspicious circumstances. Carter sent a brief email, requesting a meeting. He had barely closed the laptop when his phone, a cheap prepaid burner he had picked up with what little money he had, rang. No caller ID. He hesitated before answering. Hello? A low voice, barely above a whisper. Walk away, Carter. His body went rigid. Who is this? A beat of silence. Then, you're poking around in things that don't concern you anymore. Be smart. Drop it. Carter's grip on the phone tightened. If this is Vincent, a sharp chuckle. Vincent's already won. You lost, remember? Stay lost. The line went dead. Carter exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs. Someone was watching. Someone knew he was getting close. He ran a hand down his face, his mind racing. There was no doubt anymore. Vincent wasn't just corrupt. He was dangerous. And if Vincent had gone this far to erase people from the past, what had really happened to Rowan's brother? Carter looked toward the hallway, where Rowan's soft footsteps echoed in the distance. She didn't know yet, but when she did, there was no turning back. Rowan stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The black car was there again, parked just a little too far down the street to seem obvious, but not far enough to go unnoticed. It had been there yesterday, and the day before that. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a coincidence. Behind her, Carter was at the kitchen table, flipping through old papers, his focus sharp. There's something wrong, she said, her voice controlled but tense. Carter glanced up. What is it? She nodded toward the window. That car. It's been sitting there for days. Carter's expression darkened. He stood, moving beside her, his gaze locked on the vehicle. Tinted windows, he murmured. Unmarked plates. They're watching us. Rowan felt a chill run down her spine. Who? Carter exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Vincent's people, probably. He knows I've been digging. Rowan's fingers clenched. So this is because of you. Carter didn't deny it. Her blood boiled. You brought this here. He turned to her, voice steady. Rowan, I didn't know they'd come after you. But they have. Her voice rose, and for the first time, she felt a deep, gut-wrenching fear. This wasn't just about Carter. Elliot was in the house. Her pulse quickened. I have a kid to protect. Carter's jaw tightened. I know. Do you? She took a step back, her anger barely containing the panic underneath. Because if anything happens to him, nothing will happen to him. His voice was sharp, controlled. I won't let it. Rowan shook her head. You can't promise that. A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Rowan inhaled shakily. You need to leave. Carter flinched. Rowan, this is my home, my son's home. I won't have him living in fear because of your past. Carter's expression shifted, something flickering in his eyes. Not just frustration, but something deeper. A quiet, painful understanding. Rowan turned away, arms wrapping around herself. She wasn't just angry, she was afraid. And she hated that he was the reason why. Rowan sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out before her. The edges were frayed from years of handling, but it wasn't the words from her brother that made her hands tremble. It was the folded pages tucked inside. They weren't personal letters. They were numbers, bank statements, transaction records. Carter leaned over her shoulder, scanning the documents with sharp eyes. His expression shifted from confusion to grim understanding. These aren't just random accounts, he muttered. They're company records. These show funds being moved, hidden. Rowan's breath hitched. My brother was right. He was trying to expose something. Carter grabbed a separate sheet, flipping it over, his pulse quickening. He recognized some of the account numbers. They weren't just linked to old property deals. These were off-the-books transactions. Money that had been laundered, funneled through dummy corporations. This is fraud, he said, voice low but firm. And not just minor fraud. This is years of financial manipulation. Rowan clenched her fists. Vincent was behind it. Carter nodded slowly, still staring at the evidence. And he didn't just bury the truth. He burned it. If your brother had these, it means he was getting too close. And if he was getting too close... Rowan swallowed hard. He didn't die in an accident, did he? The silence between them was heavy. Carter exhaled, placing the papers down carefully. We have proof. Real proof. If we release this... Vincent falls, Rowan finished, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. They both knew what this meant. This wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't just about the past. It was about justice. And for the first time, Rowan wasn't afraid of what came next. Rowan sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the documents still spread across the table. The weight of the truth pressed on her chest, but something else lingered in her mind. Something she wasn't ready to name. Carter was beside her, quiet, his fingers laced together as if holding back words. The tension between them had changed. It wasn't just anger, or suspicion, or even shared purpose. It was something deeper, something dangerous. You should hate me, Carter said finally, his voice low. Rowan looked at him, startled. For everything my company did to your family, he continued. For the way I lived, blind to all of this. He gestured toward the papers, then exhaled. And yet, here we are. Rowan studied him. The man sitting beside her wasn't the Carter Wexley she had imagined for years. That man had been untouchable, powerful, unaware of the destruction left in his wake. But this man, this version of him, was different. Worn down, yes, but also awake in a way he hadn't been before. I did hate you, she admitted. For a long time. She hesitated before adding, but I don't think I do anymore. Carter turned to her then, something shifting in his expression. She felt her pulse quicken as his gaze softened, his walls cracking just enough to let her see inside. A sudden cry from down the hall shattered the moment. Elliot! Rowan was already on her feet, But Carter moved faster, reaching the boy's bedroom first. When she stepped inside, she found Carter kneeling beside Elliot's bed, whispering something soft, reassuring. Elliot clung to him, his small hands gripping Carter's sleeve. "It was the fire," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "It was everywhere." Carter placed a hand on the boy's back. "Steady. You're safe," he said. "Nothing is going to happen to you." Rowan's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen Carter like this, gentle, patient. Elliot trusted him, and somehow, so did she. Elliot's breathing slowed, his grip loosening as he drifted back to sleep. Carter carefully tucked the blanket around him before stepping away, his movements careful. When they returned to the living room, Rowan didn't sit back down. Instead, she turned to Carter, searching his face. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Carter shrugged. "I wanted to." The truth hit her then, sharp and undeniable. She couldn't ignore what she felt for him anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that settled deep, pressing against the walls. Rowan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter, knowing its weight extended far beyond ink and paper. Carter stood nearby, his shoulders tense, his gaze flicking toward the window every few minutes. He had been on edge ever since the phone call. She could feel it in the way he moved, the way he barely let Elliot out of his sight. Something was coming. Then, a noise outside. Carter stiffened. Rowan's heart leapt into her throat. It wasn't the wind, wasn't an animal. It was footsteps. The front door rattled. Then, a loud crash. Rowan gasped as two figures burst inside, their faces obscured by dark clothing. Before she could react, Carter moved, shoving her behind him. "Where is it?" One of them barked, stepping forward. Rowan's pulse pounded. "Where is what?" "The letter." The man snapped. "We know you have it." Carter took a step forward, his body shielding hers completely. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice controlled. The second man lunged. Carter reacted fast, blocking the blow, sending a sharp punch to his ribs. The man staggered, but the first attacker moved in, landing a brutal hit to Carter's side. Rowan scrambled for something, anything, her hands finally closing around a cast-iron pan. Without thinking, she swung. The sound of impact rang through the room as the first man crumpled. Carter turned just in time to dodge another strike, but the second man caught him off guard, slamming him into the kitchen counter. He groaned, pain flashing across his face, but still, he fought. Rowan barely processed what happened next. Carter throwing the last punch, the man hitting the ground, both intruders now motionless. She grabbed the phone with trembling hands, dialing emergency services. The adrenaline didn't fade until she turned and saw Carter gripping his side, blood seeping through his shirt. Her breath caught. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," he muttered. But when he took a step forward, he winced. She moved to him, her hands hovering over his shirt. "Sit down," she ordered. He hesitated, but exhaustion won. He collapsed onto a chair, exhaling sharply. Rowan grabbed the first aid kit, kneeling beside him. "You're an idiot," she muttered as she pressed a cloth to the wound. Carter let out a weak chuckle. "I've been told that before." Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and Carter noticed. His voice softened. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him then, something raw in her eyes. "You just threw yourself in front of them for me." He held her gaze. "Of course I did." Something shifted between them in that moment, unspoken but undeniable. For the first time, Rowan wasn't just angry, or wary, or uncertain. She was afraid, not of Carter, but of how much she had come to care. Carter sat at the kitchen table, his hand pressed lightly against the bandage on his side. The pain was manageable, but the weight in his chest was something else entirely. Across from him, Rowan watched him carefully, her fingers drumming against the edge of the table. Neither of them had spoken in several minutes. The house still felt unsettled from the break-in, but there was no time to dwell on it. They had something bigger to face. "We have to end this," Rowan said finally, her voice firm. Carter met her gaze, nodding. "Vincent's not going to stop. Not unless we make him." She pushed the letter and the documents across the table. "This is enough to bury him." But we need the right place, the right moment. Carter exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had spent years in boardrooms, manipulating deals, turning situations in his favor. Now, he was on the other side of it, trying to bring down the very system he once ruled. Vincent is hosting a gala next weekend, he said. It's a charity event, but really it's a public display. He's presenting his new company vision. If we hit him there, in front of the people he's trying to impress, he won't be able to escape. Rowan folded her arms. And what's your plan? Just walk in and hand over the proof? Carter smirked, but there was no humor in it. Not exactly. Rowan arched a brow. You still think like him. Carter leaned forward, his voice lower now. I know how men like Vincent operate. He'll try to deny everything. But if we make enough noise, if we put the right eyes on this, he won't be able to spin his way out of it. Rowan studied him for a long moment. Then she reached for the documents, slipping them into a folder. Then we do it. Together. Carter hesitated. Rowan, if this goes wrong... I know the risks, she interrupted. But this isn't just about you, Carter. It never was. Her words hit harder than he expected. He nodded, swallowing past the tension in his throat. She stood, but instead of walking away, she lingered. I need to ask you something. Carter met her eyes. Go ahead. Her fingers tightened around the folder. If we do this, if we bring him down, what happens after? Carter's chest tightened. He had spent his entire life building an empire, then watching it crumble. For the first time, he didn't have an answer about what came next. I don't know, he admitted. Rowan sighed, looking away for a moment before returning her gaze to him. Then prove to me that this isn't just about revenge. Carter nodded. I will. She turned to walk away, but he called after her. Rowan. She paused, waiting. Thank you, he said. The words quieter than he intended. Rowan didn't say anything, but the look she gave him before disappearing down the hall was enough. This wasn't just about justice. This was about trust. And for Carter, it was the last chance to prove he deserved it. The gala was an extravagant display of wealth and power, exactly the kind of event Carter had once dominated. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the grand ballroom, where New York's elite sipped champagne and exchanged polite, calculated smiles. Waiters in crisp uniforms weaved between the guests, offering trays of hors d'oeuvres that cost more than most people's monthly rent. At the far end of the room, standing confidently on the stage, was Vincent Calloway. He exuded effortless charm, dressed in a tailored suit, his expression calm as he addressed the crowd. He spoke of the future, of innovation, of how his company was stronger than ever. Carter stepped through the entrance, his presence barely acknowledged at first. He no longer belonged here, not in the way he once had. But tonight, that didn't matter. Rowan was at his side, clutching the folder containing the documents. She was tense, but her resolve was firm. Are you sure about this? She murmured. Carter didn't answer. He walked forward, each step a reminder that he had nothing left to lose. Vincent's voice carried across the room, smooth and confident. The world is changing, and we are at the forefront of that change. We, Carter interrupted, his voice cutting through the polished atmosphere like a blade. That's a nice speech, Vincent. The room stilled. Heads turned. Whispers spread through the crowd. Vincent's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Carter, he said, feigning surprise. I didn't realize you were on the guest list. Carter stepped closer, holding up the folder. I thought I'd bring a gift. He opened it, pulling out one of the financial records. Tell me, Vincent, do these numbers look familiar? A murmur rippled through the room. People shifted, intrigued. Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. I'm not sure what game you're playing, but this isn't the time or place. Oh, I think it is, Carter said, his voice cold. He turned to the crowd. These documents prove that Vincent has been committing financial fraud for years. Laundering money, illegal acquisitions. He built this empire on corruption. Rowan stepped forward, holding out the letter. And my brother tried to expose him. He died trying. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Vincent's mask of composure cracked for just a second before he let out a dismissive laugh. This is pathetic, he said. You expect people to believe the word of a disgraced businessman and a woman looking for someone to blame? Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. I expect them to look at the evidence. Vincent spread his arms, turning to the guests as if presenting a spectacle. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've all seen how far desperation can drive a man. His smile was sharp, his words dripping with amusement. Carter lost everything, and now he's looking for someone to blame. The doubt settled over the room like a shadow. People weren't sure what to believe. Rowan gritted her teeth, stepping closer to Carter. They're falling for it, she whispered. Carter's grip on the papers tightened. He had expected Vincent to deny it. He had expected resistance. But what he hadn't counted on was how easily Vincent could manipulate the narrative. Vincent smirked. Security, please escort these two out. The moment was slipping. Carter could feel it. And then, something happened that neither of them expected. A voice from the crowd. Wait, someone called out. The room shifted, and a man stepped forward. An older gentleman, sharp-eyed and serious. James Richter, the former accountant Carter had contacted. I worked for this company, James said, his voice steady. I saw what Vincent was doing. I tried to speak up, and I was fired for it. Vincent's smirk vanished. James pulled out a USB drive from his pocket and held it up. And I kept records. The tension in the room snapped. People murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Journalists in the crowd took out their phones. Vincent's confidence flickered, and for the first time that night, he looked genuinely afraid. Carter stepped forward, lowering his voice so only Vincent could hear. Looks like your empire is finally crumbling. For the first time in years, Vincent Calloway had no words. The room was in chaos. Murmurs turned into frantic whispers, and security hesitated, unsure whether to follow Vincent's orders or step aside in the face of the mounting evidence. Cameras flashed, capturing every tense moment, and the weight of the scandal was finally pressing down on Vincent Calloway. But then, everything stopped. A single voice cut through the noise, a sharp, terrified cry. Mom! Rowan's blood ran cold. She turned just in time to see Vincent gripping Elliot's arm, pulling him back toward a side exit. The boy struggled, panic flashing in his wide eyes. Let him go. Rowan's voice cracked as she surged forward, but Vincent yanked Elliot closer, pressing a hand against the boy's shoulder in warning. The crowd's murmurs faded into a suffocating silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Carter stepped forward, his face unreadable, but his entire body was coiled with tension. Vincent, he said, voice measured. You don't want to do this. Vincent let out a low, bitter laugh. Oh, I think I do, he sneered. You've backed me into a corner, Carter. And I don't like corners. He tightened his grip on Elliot, making the boy whimper. So here's how this is going to go. You're going to take your little folder of lies and burn it. Right here, right now. And if you do that, maybe I let the kid go. Rowan's breathing was ragged, her eyes darting between Carter and Elliot. She turned to Carter, desperation overtaking her voice. Please. Carter, please. Carter didn't answer right away. His eyes locked onto Vincent's, unwavering. His entire life had been about control, gaining it, keeping it, using it. But right now, he had none. Vincent smirked, sensing hesitation. What's it going to be, Carter? He taunted. Revenge? Or the kid? The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. Carter exhaled, his chest tight, and then he moved. Faster than anyone could react, he lunged forward, shoving Vincent back with enough force that the man stumbled. Elliot broke free, running straight into Rowan's waiting arms as Vincent staggered, momentarily thrown off balance. Security finally snapped into action, surrounding Vincent before he could escape. Rowan clutched Elliot, pressing frantic kisses to his hair, her body shaking. But her eyes stayed on Carter. Carter, who had just risked everything, not to take Vincent down, but to keep Elliot safe. And in that moment, Rowan knew. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about something much deeper. Vincent straightened his suit, his composure slipping as security formed a tight circle around him. His grip on control, on the life he had built, was unraveling faster than he could contain it. But his arrogance remained. You think this changes anything? He sneered. A few papers? The word of a disgraced businessman and a desperate woman? He scoffed, shaking his head. This is nothing. Carter took a slow step forward, his expression calm. Nothing? He gestured to the crowd, to the flashing cameras, to the wide-eyed investors whispering among themselves. Looks like a lot of people disagree. Vincent's jaw clenched. I used to be like you, Carter continued, his voice deliberate, untouchable, certain I could control every outcome, that no matter what happened, I'd always land on my feet. He tilted his head slightly. Remind me, how'd that work out for me? Vincent's smirk faltered. Carter stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough so that Vincent had to lean in to hear. You made one mistake, he said. You got sloppy. You trusted the wrong people. You assumed you could intimidate everyone into silence. He paused, letting the words settle. But I know how men like you think, Vincent. And I knew exactly what would make you talk. Vincent frowned, shifting uncomfortably. What the hell are you talking about? Carter slowly pulled his phone from his pocket and turned the screen toward Vincent. The red recording light blinked. Vincent's face drained of color. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few journalists moved closer, eager to catch every word. Rowan held Elliot tightly, her grip protective but her eyes locked on Carter. She understood what he had done. You set me up, Vincent growled, his fists curling. Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You set yourself up. Before Vincent could react, two uniformed officers stepped forward. Vincent Calloway, one said, voice firm. You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and illegal business practices. A ripple of shock spread through the room as the officers took Vincent by the arms. He struggled, his polished mask cracking completely. This is a mistake. I built this company. I own this city. Carter watched as Vincent was led through the crowd, his voice growing more desperate with every step. But no one moved to help him. The people who once shook his hand now looked away. Elliot pressed his face into Rowan's shoulder, safe but shaken. She kissed his forehead before meeting Carter's gaze. It was over, and for the first time, Carter wasn't the one losing everything. The aftermath of Vincent's downfall rippled through the city like a storm. His empire crumbled under the weight of his crimes, and with it, the world Carter had once belonged to. The news spread fast. His former colleagues, investors, and so-called friends now scrambling to distance themselves from the wreckage. Some were already looking for a new leader to step in, to rebuild what had been lost. And they wanted Carter. The offer came quickly. A board member reached out, laying out the details with smooth efficiency. The company was restructuring. They needed a steady hand, someone who understood the business. Carter's name still held weight, and with Vincent gone, there was a power vacuum. It was everything he had once dreamed of. A way back, a second chance to reclaim what he had built. But as he stood in the small kitchen of Rowan's home, listening to the hum of the coffee maker, watching Elliot sketch at the table, he realized something. He didn't want it. The thought hit him with startling clarity. The money, the power, the control, it had once defined him. But now, it felt distant, like a life that belonged to someone else. You okay? Rowan's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to find her leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching him carefully. They offered me my old life back, he admitted. Rowan stiffened, but her expression remained unreadable. And I said no. A pause. Then, why? Carter exhaled, setting his coffee down. Because it doesn't mean anything anymore. He met her gaze. I spent years chasing something I thought made me untouchable. And the second it was gone, I realized I had nothing. No one. Rowan studied him, something shifting in her expression. Carter hesitated before continuing, his voice lower now. I don't want to go back to that world, Rowan. I don't want to be that man again. He swallowed hard. I want this. He gestured around the modest kitchen, toward Elliot, toward her. I want a life that actually matters. Rowan took a slow step forward, her eyes searching his for something. Doubt, hesitation. But she didn't find any. For so long, she had held onto her anger, convinced Carter would never change, that he was just another man who took without thinking. But now, standing in front of her, was someone else entirely. Someone who had lost everything and somehow found something better in its place. She reached up, her fingers brushing against his cheek, hesitant but certain. "You mean that?" Carter caught her hand, pressing it against his chest. "I do." For the first time, Rowan let go of the past, and when she leaned in, pressing her lips softly against his, Carter knew this was the only future he wanted. The air smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, the scent of something new, something rebuilt from the ground up. Carter stood in the doorway of a small office, watching as movers carried in the last few pieces of furniture. The space was modest, nothing like the glass-walled offices he had once occupied. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was building something that truly mattered. The sign above the door read, Wexley Housing Initiative. It wasn't about skyscrapers or luxury developments. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about giving people a second chance, helping families like Rowan's. Families who had been displaced, overlooked, left to struggle with no way forward. He had spent weeks making the right calls, using the few connections he had left to secure funding. Not from investors looking for a return, but from people who actually wanted to help. It wasn't about profit. It was about purpose. Rowan stepped inside, glancing around with a small smile. "You've been busy," she said, running her fingers along the edge of a desk. Carter leaned against the doorway. "Not bad for a man who used to think charity was a waste of time." She smirked. "I still remember that version of you." He chuckled. "I'd rather not." Elliot ran in a moment later, carrying a roll of blueprints. "Where do these go?" he asked, excitement in his voice. Carter pointed to a side table. "Right there, kid." Elliot set them down carefully, then turned back to face him. "Mom says you're helping people find houses now." "That's the plan." The boy tilted his head, considering. "Does that mean we're staying here?" Rowan's eyes flickered to Carter, the question lingering in the air between them. Carter didn't hesitate. He met her gaze, then looked at Elliot. "Yeah," he said. "We're staying." Rowan's expression softened, something warm and certain settling in her eyes. Elliot grinned. "Good." The boy took off toward the back of the office, and Carter turned to Rowan. "So, officially a couple now," he teased, crossing his arms. Rowan laughed. "I think it's safe to say that." Carter reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Good," he murmured. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking toward the next deal, the next fortune, the next ladder to climb. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Rowan stood at the edge of the overgrown front yard, staring at the house she had once called home. The peeling paint, the broken shutters, the sagging porch. It was all still there, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a ruin. It felt like a promise. Carter stepped beside her, wiping sweat from his brow, his hands still covered in dust and paint. "It's coming along," he said, his voice edged with exhaustion but also pride. She glanced at him, taking in the sight. He had spent weeks working on this place, refusing to hire contractors when he could do it himself. She had watched him tear up rotted floorboards, patch holes in the walls, and restore the structure piece by piece, as if fixing the house was his own way of making peace with the past. Rowan crossed her arms, smirking slightly. "Not bad for someone who used to build high-rises." Carter chuckled. "I think I like this better." She turned back to the house, exhaling. "I never thought I'd see it like this again. You should have never had to lose it in the first place." His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was heavy. He knew what his company had taken from her family, and now, without saying it, he was giving it back. She took a slow step toward the porch, running her fingers along the wooden railing that he had sanded and stained himself. It felt solid, strong. She pressed her palm against it, letting the warmth of the wood ground her. Elliot's voice rang out from inside. "Mom, come see my room." Rowan smiled and headed inside, Carter following. The space smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, but there was light spilling through the newly installed windows, casting a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Elliot stood in the center of his small room, grinning. "Carter let me pick the color," he said proudly, pointing to the soft blue walls. "And look, I have a real bed now." Rowan ran her fingers over the wooden bed frame Carter had built himself. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. It's perfect. Carter leaned against the doorway, watching her carefully. She turned to him, something unspoken passing between them. This house wasn't just about fixing the past. It was about finally moving forward. And for the first time, Rowan let herself believe that they really could. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the front yard as Carter tightened the last screw on the new fence. He wiped his hands on his jeans, stepping back to admire the work. It wasn't perfect, but it was sturdy, reliable, a lot like the life he was building here. Rowan stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching him with a smirk. You know, for someone who used to spend his days in boardrooms, you're not half bad at this. Carter chuckled. Careful, I might start charging you for my services. Before Rowan could respond, Elliot came bounding out of the house, his sneakers slapping against the wooden steps. Mom, Carter, come see what I built. They followed him to the side of the house, where a collection of uneven wooden planks had been hammered together into a wobbly-looking treehouse frame. Carter crouched beside it, running a hand over the rough edges. Not bad, kid, he said, nodding approvingly. Who helped you? Elliot grinned. I did it myself. I watched you build the porch, so I kinda copied you. Carter raised an eyebrow, impressed. You've got a good eye for construction. Elliot shrugged. Well, I gotta learn from you, right? You are my dad now. The words were so casual, so effortless, that it took a second for them to register. Carter froze. Rowan inhaled sharply beside him, but neither of them spoke. Elliot, completely unaware of the impact of his words, picked up a hammer and started adjusting one of the boards. Carter swallowed, his chest tightening in a way he hadn't expected. Dad. It wasn't something Elliot had been forced to say. It wasn't something he had been told to call him. It had just happened, and in that moment, Carter realized that all the wealth, all the power, all the influence he had once worshipped, none of it compared to this. He wasn't Carter Wexley, the businessman, anymore. He was Carter, the man who had built a life worth holding on to. And for the first time, he didn't want anything more. The sky was painted in shades of amber and violet as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the front porch. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying the scent of fresh earth and wood from the renovations still underway. It was peaceful, the kind of peace Carter had never known in his old life. He sat on the porch steps, arms resting on his knees, watching as Elliot chased fireflies in the yard, laughing each time one slipped through his fingers. Rowan was beside him, curled up against the railing, her eyes soft with quiet contentment. For a long time, they didn't speak. They didn't have to. Carter exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle inside him. I used to think this kind of life wasn't enough, he admitted. Rowan turned her head, watching him. And now? He glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. Now, I realize it's the only thing that ever mattered. She didn't say anything right away, just studied him with that knowing look she had, like she could see every layer he had tried to keep hidden. You don't regret it? She asked. Losing everything? Carter looked out at the horizon, the last light of the sun disappearing into the trees. He had spent years chasing wealth, power, a legacy built on numbers and transactions. And in the end, none of it had been real. None of it had ever given him the kind of warmth he felt now, sitting here, in a home he had helped rebuild, with a family that had given him a second chance. No, he said finally. Losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. Rowan reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Carter squeezed lightly, grounding himself in the warmth of her touch. Elliot ran up to them, slightly out of breath, his face glowing with excitement. I almost caught one, he said, plopping down beside them. Carter chuckled. You'll get there. Elliot rested his head against Rowan's shoulder, his energy finally settling. Mom, do you think we're going to stay here forever? Rowan glanced at Carter before answering. Yeah, baby, she said softly. I think we will. Elliot yawned, nodding sleepily. Good. Carter felt something deep in his chest, a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fading sunlight. He had spent his whole life believing riches were built on power. But now, as he sat with his family, Watching the stars blink into existence above their home, he understood the truth. Some riches are built on power. Others are built on love. Only one of them lasts forever. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant warmth of coffee brewing inside. Carter stood on the porch, a steaming mug in his hands, watching as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The sky was a soft blend of blues and golds, stretching over the land like a quiet promise. Behind him, the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor made him turn. Rowan stepped outside, pulling her cardigan closer around her shoulders. Her hair was still slightly messy from sleep, and there was something effortlessly beautiful about the way she moved, calm, steady, as if she finally had the space to breathe. "You're up early," she murmured, leaning against the porch railing beside him. Carter smirked, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Old habits." She glanced at him, tilting her head, thinking about what comes next. He exhaled, watching the mist from his breath fade into the morning air. "Not in the way I used to." There had been a time when his thoughts were consumed by what came next. The next deal, the next power move, the next step to prove his worth. Now, it was different. Now, what came next wasn't about climbing higher, but about building something real. Rowan studied him for a moment before reaching for the mug in his hands. He let her take it, watching as she brought it to her lips for a small sip before handing it back. "You're adjusting well," she noted. Carter chuckled. "You sound surprised." "I am." She didn't sugarcoat it, and he loved that about her. Most people don't walk away from the life you had. Not when they get a chance to take it back. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Maybe they never had a reason to. A soft breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves, filling the silence between them. From inside the house, the sound of Elliot stirring reached them, footsteps on the wooden floor, a sleepy voice muttering something as he woke. Rowan smiled. He's still not used to sleeping in his own room. Keeps sneaking into mine halfway through the night. Carter smirked. "Give it time." She turned to him then, her expression softer. "And you?" He raised a brow. "What about me? Are you still getting used to this?" She gestured around them. To the house, to the land, to the life they had built together. Carter took a slow breath, letting the warmth of the moment settle deep in his chest. He had once thought that success meant winning, conquering, controlling. But standing here, with Rowan beside him and the promise of a future that wasn't dictated by greed or power, he realized he had been wrong all along. This was success. This was home. "I'm right where I'm supposed to be," he said finally. Rowan didn't reply, but she didn't need to. She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together as the sun rose a little higher, casting golden light over everything they had built. Carter squeezed her hand, a quiet certainty settling in his chest. He had spent his whole life searching for wealth, but it wasn't until he lost everything that he understood what true riches really were. And this time, he wasn't letting go.